so clean.
Good evening, Showalter. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yes, sir. So, it's a few other people that have come in. They run a little late, maybe one or two. But I thank you for taking your time out today to join us on the podcast. Spin Cycle 733. Usually, my cousin hosts the podcast, but he has some family duties today, so he couldn't make it up here. But this is being shot live from Martinsburg, West Virginia.
Okay.
Well, not live, but being recorded. Excuse me. Yeah. So it's being recorded live from Martinsburg, West Virginia. I'm up here with a family friend, but I don't know if in the last few days you had time to actually look over the paper. But I had contacted you, maybe a few weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, concerning Anthony's situation, and I know you had the chance to speak with his attorney, Mr. John Polar. Uh, and he told you it was all right to do the podcast, which as I say before, it's a true blessing that you took the time out your night to come talk with me concerning Anthony's situation. Um, I know that you evaluated my brother back in March of March 5th of 2016, and I knew it was another date right prior to that. But what I'm asking you tonight is just to get your thoughts and feelings about the situation, on what you read, and how you feel about the situation.
Uh, well, this is a long saga
Yes,
that
sir.
began when. Is it okay if I just refer to him as Tony or
Yes, sir.
Anthony?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
That began when he had that massive head injury.
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
and, you know, one of the things that we know is that when someone suffers a head injury like that, it increases their vulnerability over time to uh, have their brain functioning deteriorate. You know,
Yes, sir.
uh, after that post head injury, the most recovery you're going to get is about a year to 18 months after the injury.
Yes, sir.
That's when you'll get the most recovery you're going to get. And then after that, um, you know, you're kind of at that point uh, where your deficits are going to be pretty stable. You know,
Right.
no matter what rehabilitation you do, it's not going to bring back further recovery. It doesn't mean a person can't learn things, but
Yes, sir.
it's very difficult for them. And in Tony's case, uh, the biggest issue that I saw when I evaluated him in 2015, and then I evaluated him again in 2016, uh, is just the impairment in what we call the higher cognitive functionings, like abstract thinking, planning ahead, being able to, you know, think at a level where you can incorporate a lot of information and use that information to come to a reasonable conclusion, whether it's a decision you have to make or whether it's a problem you're trying to solve, etc. And so, my evaluations of him really, I was just struck by his inability to do that, which, for most of us is, situations come up, you think it through, you come to a conclusion about how you're going to react to that and make that decision and move forward.
Yes, sir.
Whereas with, Tony, that just wasn't there. And that's what is a critical aspect of being competent to stand trial.
Yes, sir.
Um, you can, people with injuries like Tony, they can think at a concrete level much better than they can an abstract level. And kind of what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. You know, a concrete ideas like, what is a judge and what do they do in court? And that's a question you have to answer. It's called having a factual understanding.
Yes, sir.
Well, a judge, keeps order in the court. They listen to both sides and give a verdict and provide the sentence. That's fairly concrete. Uh, but when it comes to the what we call the rational understanding that's required for a person to be competent, that's where the deficits really, came to bear in Tony's case. That ability for abstract thinking, uh, being able to process a lot of different information to come to a decision about what's in his best interest, things like that. So um, that's clearly, in my view, what kept him from being competent to stand trials, to have a rational understanding of where things are at. I'll give you one example, and then I'll give you a chance to ask questions. I know I'm
No,
rambling
no,
on.
no, sir. I'm listening. Definitely take your time.
Uh, but in one of I think it was the second time that I evaluated him, uh, I had spoken with another evaluator uh, about their conclusions regarding his competency. And when I was talking to Tony about a plea bargain that he had been offered in one of his
Yes, sir.
cases, um, it was like, you have to consider the weight of the evidence against you and say, do I want to take a chance and try to beat this at trial? Or is it a better to just go ahead and take the deal?
Yes, sir.
And discussing that in the one valuation I had with Tony, it was like, well, no, I'm not going to take a plea bargain, because he knew somebody else in a very similar situation who
Right.
had been offered a plea bargain, and they declined the plea bargain, went to trial, and beat the charge. So in his case, it was like, well, he didn't take the plea bargain and he beat the charge. So that's what will happen with me, without any apparent ability to recognize the weight of the evidence against him. And again, that goes back to this rational aspect that must be there to be competent to stand trial. And the two times I evaluated Tony, it just, he was never able to demonstrate sufficient rational thinking about his case that he could be competent.
Yes, sir. What was amazing to me is because I sit throughout the proceeding of the trial. So back in 2015, when Mr. Ken Robinson was his original attorney, and all of this
Mm-hmm.
came about, and he did the evaluation, got him evaluated or whatever, and come to find out now that you was one of the evaluators. Years later, because I didn't had the paperwork, you know, available to see who was the actual evaluator. What
Uh-huh.
was amazing to me about him was his reality of the situation, like you're saying, like weighing the pros and cons of, if you go to trial, this could happen versus you taking a plea bargain. And
Mm-hmm.
what I was when Mr. Ken, finally got him evaluated, and then it came back, you and other doctors, throughout time saying, "Hey, this man's incompetent." What was so mind blowing to me about this last situation with Dr. Scott Bender was, like, when you read the evaluation, the actual evaluation, and the last evaluation that was conducted by Dr. Scott Bender was on December 15th, 2020. When you read the evaluation at the beginning part, you see kind of what he's adding to the dialogue of the literature that's in the evaluation. Other doctors that's evaluated them over a 7 to 8 year period. From 2015
Mm-hmm.
to 5 year period, from 2015 to 2020. And what was striking to me is Dr. Scott Bender, I would say, within an 18-month period, evaluated Anthony 4 times. And out of those 4 evaluations, the first 3 evaluations of the first 4, he said, the first one, incompetent to stand trial.
Uh-huh.
Second one, incompetent to stand trial. And the third one, he comes back with incompetent, unrestorable, and for the foreseeable future. So I was like, wow, this is powerful, because twice this has happened to Anthony. Once in 2017, I believe, by Dr. psychiatrist by the name of Michael Bell, and then once
Uh-huh.
again in 2020 by Dr. Scott Bender. What was well, obviously 2019, excuse me. So then when he does this last evaluation, he had just beat these charges, 14 charges. You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Whatever it was, drug charges, whatever, drug associated charges. He beat these charges, and then less than like 60 days. I don't know the exact window. It was less than 60 days from the time he had just found him incompetent, unrestorable for the foreseeable future. And he comes back and says he's competent to stand trial. So we're mind blown. We're like, how? Like that's what we're saying as a family and other people around him that's friends. Like, how is he competent to stand trial? So then when he finally goes to trial, they take him to this 2-day jury trial, February 24th. I mean, February 24th and February 25th of 2022. He goes in front of the jury or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They do they put on a trial or whatever, and then they find him guilty. So throughout that process, prior to him going, I was going getting all this paperwork, everything that's associated with my brother from the time that he had his accident at 16 to present.
Uh-huh.
Going back as far as 94, I believe. I think it was around like 1994. His school records, everything says on there traumatic brain injury, traumatic
Mm-hmm.
brain injury. Low IQ. And what stood out to me the most was is that when he went to the sentencing phase on August 9th of 2022 to the sentencing hearing, at that time period, his attorney at the time, Mr. Melvin Hill, subpoenaed Dr. Scott Bender to court to speak, to the evaluation that he just had done, where he found him competent to stand trial after finding him prior to that, like 45 to 60 days before that, incompetent and unrestorable. He's like, how
Uh-huh.
did you get to that? So when he gets up there, Dr. Scott Bender goes completely against his evaluation. And that was mind blowing to us. Like the judge is hearing this. And then when former Commonwealth attorney Mary Lester cross examines Dr. Scott Bender, she asks him a very, very good question, I believe, to me. She say, would you say that Anthony has any type of mental disease? He says, yes. She said, what would you call it? He said, we would call it multifactorial, uh, multifactorial, uh, no, he said neuro cognitive multifactorial ideology. And then he names all the instruments involved that makes my brother the way he is. The end stage renal disease, the traumatic
Mm-hmm.
brain injury, and the low IQ. And what we're saying is, he says in the literature of, I have this in the transcripts of the sentencing hearing. He says at the sentencing hearing, she said, well, you said in this last evaluation, which I'm gonna read a little bit of it while we sitting here. She said
Okay.
that you said that he actually got better. And my thing to that was, if my brother, and this is for anybody, this is could be scientific for any person. If you take a person that's been on the streets, who's been getting high, who's already living with end-stage renal disease since 2018, because now we're in 2020 at this time period, and he's dealing with the effects that the end-stage renal disease further damages cognitive function, and then
Mm-hmm.
you put him in a jail where he's not getting high, he's eating properly, which I wouldn't even call it properly. I would just say he's eating a steady diet and he's off of drugs. Dr. Bender says he becomes more alert, but then he goes on to say in the same sentence, but that still shows how he's very, very impaired cognitively. I thought that was mind blowing to me. And me being a person, I'm not a doctor, but
Mm-hmm.
I can read and I can comprehend what I read.
Mm-hmm.
What is your feelings to what he said in that moment at the trial? Because when he asked, one more thing I want to say, when his lawyer gets back up and cross examined, he said between the first or second evaluation, or in between your evaluations, what services was rendered that restored him to competence to stand trial? Dr. Bender says none, as I know of. What's your feelings on that?
Uh, uh, speechless.
Right.
Uh, I yeah, um, I don't know. Okay, I'm supposed to be better than this.
No,
But
but
no,
this is a real
no, I
reaction from
think,
somebody that's been in this medical field.
yeah, no, it's, I would, I would have to kind of read the report that's going, he's unrestorable, and then, see specifically what was said in court. But on the surface of it, it doesn't compute to me at all.
Right,
Uh, you have, again, you have such a long history uh, of impairment, and of course, if and when he's using drugs, that makes it even worse. But
right.
once you stop using drugs, yeah, attention and concentration are just basic brain functions. I mean, those are, or being more alert because you don't have the influence of these illicit chemicals in your brain, but it doesn't. In terms of the long-term effects of the brain damage he suffered, that it doesn't. Uh, I know of no case where that would have changed him sufficiently that he could become competent to stand trial,
Yes,
and
sir.
particularly in light of, uh, really, as you said, he didn't get any kind of restoration services between, if I understand you correctly, between the time Dr. Bender said he was not competent and then in that 60, 90 days or whatever that he said he was competent and he went to
Yes, sir.
trial. So that's totally, I can't comprehend that. No.
Right.
I
So I'm gonna read just from you the transcripts because I pulled out the transcripts. I highlighted certain sections just to get to the point of the conversation that was going on in the courtroom on August 9th where he was sentenced. And this is
Mhm.
the dialogue between my brother's attorney and Dr. Scott Bender. And I'm gonna read it word for word. This is the transcript. So he goes on in the courtroom, and this is Mr. Hill speaking. I'm gonna speak first. He says, "I believe the last question that I was going to ask you to expand on your answer in any event. When you say he needs support system, specifically, what would you mean, assuming he were not incarcerated? What would he be? What do you suggest as a support system would be for him?" Dr. Scott Bender uh, answers the question by saying he would need daily help. So his neurocognitive functioning is impaired broadly. So his attention span is impaired. So that puts him at risk of missing important details or even not even seeing details, just important concepts because he's inattentive and distracted. His memory is very much impaired. So even if he is paying attention, it's going to be hard for him to remember concepts. So, though that memory problem doesn't seem to be limited to just visual information or auditory, it's across the board. He goes on to say his reasoning is impaired. So, when he's asked to weigh pros and cons, for example, that's going to be difficult for him. So, in a clinical setting, I would be recommending that this person have daily care. I thought that was mind blowing that this man who just recently evaluated my brother in 2022, excuse me, in 2020, who said he was incompetent, that he was competent to stand trial, and then comes back at the sentencing hearing when he was cross-examined, and he says this. How could this person ever be competent from the beginning if you're saying this now? Is my question as a person.
Yeah, I have no answer for you because again, it, it doesn't uh, it doesn't compute for me. Don't I don't see how you could, go, particularly from his long history, relatively long history of being incompetent, to, suddenly being competent to stand trial. You know, I think it was back in 2000,
Yes, sir.
he was found guilty on some charges. Around 2000, he was found competent.
Yes, sir.
But, you know, the thing is, uh, people who suffer the kind of head injury he did, uh, their cognition is much more vulnerable to decaying over time.
Yes, sir.
And so, and I can't really speak, I do know, I think it was from Central State Hospital. They found him competent around
Yes, sir.
2000. And so, yeah, that would be, I guess, possible because it was not that long after the head injury. But over time, uh, it's my understanding that people with the severe kind of head injury he had, plus, you add in a medical condition, you're much more vulnerable to, you know, cognitive decline. That's irreversible, and as I
It's
understand,
irreversible,
it's
right? So that's what we
irreversible.
would say. Our main thing was, I don't care how long you put a person in jail. I know because I've done time myself. To be, we're talking in a real discussion. I've done time myself. The
Mhm.
food while incarcerated is the worst grade of food that I probably think that a person could feed one while in the confinements of incarceration. So when you're incarcerated, you're not eating steak and potatoes or spaghetti and linguine
Uh-huh.
or the best vegetables. You're eating stuff that really shouldn't be fed to human beings. I'm not saying it's for every facility throughout the state of Virginia when you're incarcerated, but from
Mhm.
jails to the penitentiary, you're eating a very poor level of food that's being fed to you while you're incarcerated. So when the doctor said, when she asked the question, former Commonwealth Attorney Mrs. Lester asked the question to Dr. Scott Bender, you said because of his stable diet and him being within the fact that things changed. A sandwich is not going to change a traumatic brain injury. Like that's not
That's
going to
true.
fix something that a person's been living with. And just to ask you a question while we in the forum tonight having a conversation, how long have you been practicing this practicing in this medical field? And have you ever seen anything in your years of practicing in this medical field pertaining to the decision made by Dr. Scott Bender on an individual that you saw and from in being in this medical field, uh, that a person could go from competent, incompetent to competent without any services?
Um, well, to answer the first part of your question, I've been at this for 30 years.
Yes, sir.
Uh, I did do a postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology and practiced as a neuropsychologist for about 3 years before I got uh, totally into forensic psychology. So,
Yes, sir.
I have not, over the last 25 years, I have not specialized in neuropsychology, but I have a background. And so I
Yes,
have a
sir.
bit of an understanding because I did do a fellowship in neuropsychology. But like I said, the last 25 years, I've focused on forensic evaluations for competency and sanity. Uh, but, again, without uh, being able to review specifically Dr. Bender's uh, reasoning about why your brother was all of a sudden competent, uh, it's hard for me. It's hard for me to to offer any uh, critical oversight, or not oversight, but any uh, opinion about that. But on the surface
Yes,
of
sir.
it, from just the surface, I can't see how that I can't see how that could have happened.
Yes, sir. So he goes on to speak, and I have the last evaluation in front of me, and I thought it was very. I said, let me read something. So it says, amidst the variability noted above, several constraints, uh, constants have persisted throughout CST in neuropsychological evaluation. The history of learning disability, severe traumatic brain injury, end-stage renal disease, severe neurocognitive defect have been documented. In addition, Mr. Stewart has always required simplified and repeated explanations to comprehend the nature and purpose of evaluation. Finally, Mr. Stewart's effort, motivation, and overall engagement in evaluations have been highly vulnerable. In sum, there is a little doubt that Mr. Stewart has significant cognitive limitations for multiple reasons, which have at times impaired competency. In contrast to his most recent evaluations with us in 2019 in 2020, Mr. Stewart presented as much more alert, motivated, engaged, and present evaluation. There are several, this is what he goes on to say, there are several possible reasons for this improvement. A period of abstinence from drug use, a stable diet, a stable schedule and housing due to incarceration, consistency in treatment adherence for his medical conditions, and recovery from exuberation of his end-stage renal disease. I stopped right there because I thought this was very conflicting when he said his recovery from end-stage renal disease. First and foremost, a person does not make a recovery from end-stage renal disease when you're taking dialysis. The only recovery for end-stage renal disease is somebody gives you a kidney or you get a donor. And and if that's a blessing from another person or you become a match with an individual, then you're blessed because somebody can donate a kidney to you. So he never recovered from that. He's consistently got worse over time. Is like you said, that only gets worse. And the only way to fix stage renal disease is to find a donor and to get a kidney transplant. So that right there stood out for me. And then once again, he's saying a period of abstinence. As I said before, if I was abusing drugs or you was abusing drugs and you put us in a prison, say we was on the streets for a year getting high or abusing drugs. No matter what drug, it be cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, whatever. If you put us in the jail for 90 to 120 days, we can't get drugs. We'll detox. We will definitely become more alert. We'll definitely become more alert, and when dealing with people, talking to people.
Yeah, absolutely. When you are detoxed, off of illicit drugs, and I think usually they say you really need to have, I believe it's around 90 days of abstinence for your brain basically to reset, and, to get used to not having the presence of those drugs circulating. And yeah, absolutely, you will, you will be more alert. You'll kind of be, quote, more with it. Uh, but again, these are just all kind of basic functions. It's not going to change, these higher level cognitive functions, like I talked about earlier, abstract reasoning, speed of mental operations, what we call the ability to hold two competing ideas at the same time.
Right.
And that's one thing, it's another thing with, brain, particularly in serious brain injury, uh, you know, the cognitive deficits are going to be there. They will be worsened if you are using drugs. But if you're not using drugs, they're not going to recover and go back to the pre-morbid level of functioning.
Right.
They're still going to be there. Yeah.
Right. And as you said before, traumatic brain injury or any damage to the brain is irreversible.
Right.
So
Yeah.
he goes on to say, this is what I said. This is the on the back page of the evaluation that he done. The last evaluation, December. Let me get the date right. December 15th of 2020. So this is where. So he said, first, Mr. Stewart's factual understanding of the legal process. So hold on, let me go up here first. He said, when assessing competence to stand trial, it's important to consider four domains. First, understanding of the legal process. Second, appreciation of the legal process as it applies to one's particular case. Third, capacity to communicate with counsel. Four, the capacity to make decisions, though he undoubtedly continues to experience cognitive limitations due to traumatic brain injury, learning disability, and end-stage renal disease. Mr. Stewart demonstrated adequate, albeit basic and minimal abilities in each of the above areas during the present interview. First, Mr. Stewart's factual understanding of the legal process is concrete, but on a broad, very basic level. He understands the roles of legal personnel, the purpose of legal proceedings, and the charges against him. When he did not understand concepts, they were typically those that are step, and complex, and he could appreciate and retain very simplified education. Second, Mr. Stewart's sufficiently rational with education, he was able to discuss the alleged offenses in a realistic, detailed manner, including possible evidence, while he was overtly focused on one desirable outcome. Outcome was not irrational. Again, his abstract, this is his word. Again, his abstract thinking abilities are severely impaired, and questions often have to be reduced to their most rudimentary concrete form. For example, yes or no questions, or questions indicating the number of responses desired. With such support, as well as repeated education, visual cues, redirection, and encouragement, he appeared much more capable of engaging in rational decision making. Lastly, while he will need the above described support and likely other accommodations in court, Mr. Stewart appeared capable of collaboration with his attorney. Overall, Mr. Stewart appears to display at least a minimum ability in the above competency related abilities if given adequate support. Therefore, it is our opinion that Mr. Stewart displays adequate, factual, and rational understanding of his legal situation and is currently able to participate meaningfully in his defense and thereby is competent to stand trial. Now, I know you sit and heard everything that I just said, but he continues to say in the literature, though undoubtedly he continues to experience cognitive limitations due to traumatic brain injury, learning disability, and end-stage renal disease. He comes down and says the same thing again. With such support as well as repeated education and visuals, it says, again, his abstract thinking abilities are severely impaired, and questions often have to be reduced to elementary concrete forms. How is he competent? So you're saying in one element, he has all of this going on with his mentality, with his mind state. But then in another thing, you're saying, but he can still stand trial. I've never heard nothing like this.
Well, uh, what the questions you pose are just, in my opinion, on target, dead on target. And they need to be asked of the person who,
Right.
you know, offered this opinion that he was competent. And again, it's in my experience in interacting with Tony, it was just clear to me that he didn't have the rational understanding. He didn't have the ability to engage in the required uh, area of complex cognitive processing to fully understand what was going on and to be able to use that information to make decisions in his own best interest. And I refer back to what I said earlier about that time.
Yes, sir.
I understood, I think it was from Mr. Robinson, that Tony had been offered what Mr. Robinson thought was a pretty good deal, and Tony turned it down because he knew somebody else that turned down a plea offer, went
Right.
to trial, and they got off. And so that's just a very, very concrete way of looking at things without being able, and he wasn't able to demonstrate to me that he understood things like, well, the evidence might be different in your case. There might be more overwhelming evidence, and boy, it's a higher risk for you to get found guilty. He was just so focused in on, I know somebody else that turned down a plea bargain, they got off, so that's, I'm going to do
That's
the
where his
same
value
thing.
is at.
That's
Right.
not rational thinking.
Right. And he goes on to
So,
say, and I didn't have that with me. I didn't, but in there was a evaluation that was conducted by a doctor by the name of Michael Bell. He says in there, he makes something that's very. I thought he made a very good point. I can't find it in here. But what he said is when he talks about Anthony or Tony, like you said, when he talks about Tony about his brain injury and stuff, he says people like Anthony who have people like Anthony who has frontal lobe injuries, they don't associate a value with their thought process. He's basically saying, like, so he's like, people with frontal lobe injuries, you know, they make decisions on out of instinct versus hold up, let me think this through. This could be I could weigh out everything that could happen if I do this, or this scenario could take place if I do this. I believe that Dr. Bill made that very clear. Like a person like Anthony with a frontal lobe injury, they do not associate a value with the thought process. I thought it was very, it was very good that he said that. And then when I was reading other things, what was so strange about that though with Dr. Bell was he evaluated Anthony three times. First two times, he said that he thought that Anthony, when the first time he said he wasn't competent. Then the second time he comes back and said, from the day of his accident, he never was competent. And there's nothing in this current state of medicine or in the neuropsychological field that can make him competent. Then he comes back with the third evaluation of Anthony and says, I don't think he was incompetent. I don't think he was as bad as I thought he was competent. The judge at that time period found him as an unreliable witness and dismissed him as a doctor. Like 3 evaluations, Michael Bell, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I have them right here in front of me. I'm looking to see, because I have so many of them. I didn't bring all of them. I've been doing it so long, most of it I call off my head. But it says, so it goes on to say, prior competency to stand trial, neuropsychological evaluation. Mr. Stewart's competence to stand trial has been evaluated numerous times in the past with varying opinions across evaluators. His first competence to stand trial evaluation appears to have been performed at Central State Hospital on August 8th of 2000. They found him competent to stand trial. And it says, comes back. And the one that I said it stood out the most to me is when I think me and you had a conversation recently. I said it was when I look at all the evaluations in the totality, Dr. Rand stand out the most because in 2008, it says Mr. Stewart underwent a forensic neuropsychological evaluation with Thomas Rand on March 6th of 2008. Dr. Rand's test results showed extremely low intellectual functioning and diffuse cognitive defects with prominent executive dysfunction and memory impairment. He goes on to say Dr. Rand concluded that these defects were secondary to Mr. Stewart's history of learning disability, plus the effects of severe traumatic brain injury and severe traumatic brain injury which caused further decline. So when Dr. Rand says that, what is he basically saying? Because I saw evaluations where you use that same data. You said it was consistent. And I will read it real quick. This is what you said.
Okay.
In your evaluation. You said, given the available data regarding Mr. Stewart's factual and rational understanding of the judicial process to adjudicate his charges, it is my opinion that he does not meet the standard for trial competence pursuant the criteria outlined in Virginia Code 19.2-169.1. Since my original evaluation of Mr. Stewart on April 3rd of 2015 with subsequent intervention at Western State Hospital, he has somewhat increased his factual understanding of the legal process to adjudicate his charges. However, his factual understanding remains limited. For all intents and purposes, he has shown little, if any, gain with regard to the requisite rational capacities for trial competence. You're going to say, due to the nature of the compromise in his cognitive function from traumatic brain injury at the age of 16, it is my opinion that he is highly unlikely to ever gained sufficient rational capacity to meet the standard for trial competence. Results of the neuropsychological evaluation last summer at Western State documented cognitive defects broadly consistent and stable over time with the profile of impairment as found by Dr. Ryan in 2008. And I thought that was that you was using that as a reference in
Yeah.
your own dialogue. And the reason I
Mhm.
asked you at the time when you was doing these evaluations, and I know it's been a long time, so I understand if you don't, because it's hard to keep up with paperwork. I'm pretty sure you see a lot of people, especially now that
Mhm.
we've moved, 7 years into,
Mhm.
to the present that we in now. But was at that time period when you was doing these evaluations and you spoke to Ryan, did you ever see any paperwork where it was saying that Dr. Ryan found him incompetent to stand trial from the
I'm
data
sorry.
that you used?
I'm sorry.
Um,
What was the question again? I had a bit of a wave transmission problem.
yes, sir. So I see in your evaluation dated March 5th of 2016, you speak of data that you collected while doing your evaluation. It was consistent with Dr. Ryan's from 2008. You say right here, you say results of the neuropsychological evaluation last summer at Western State documented cognitive defects broadly consistent, stable over time with the profile of impairment as found by Dr. Ryan in 2008. At that time period when you was doing these evaluations, did you have any data prior to your evaluations that was done by Dr. Thomas Ryan that you looked at that you compared to yours, or that you came to this conclusion of your own, but you seen it that was consistent with an evaluation from 2008 that Dr. Thomas Ryan had did?
Yeah. So, uh, two things. His uh, Tony's presentation to me on the 2015 and 2016 evaluations, uh, his cognitive functioning was very consistent in the nature of its impairment. I
Yes, sir.
didn't really see any kind of change. And I would note that in the neuropsychological evaluation you referenced in 2015 at Western State Hospital,
Yes, sir.
the 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 neuropsychologist there used a very interesting phrase for me in referring to Tony's impairment. She said that he has stable impaired abilities. And she compared her evaluation with Dr. Ryan's and some of the others. And so this stable impaired abilities means that his impairment has not gotten any better. Where
Right.
he's impaired, it's stable, it's there. And that's the way it's going to be the rest of his life.
Right.
There's not going to be
Right.
improvement. And so I did have a copy of Dr. Ryan's report, and I saw the one from Western State. But even those aside, from the 2015 and the 2016 evaluations, I was struck too by, there's no real improvement here. The one thing that maybe some people got sidetracked a little bit by is, Tony went through, like you said, what, 16 evaluations or something like that.
I take a total
And
of about
just,
18, but you could be in the ballpark. You're
yeah,
definitely in the ballpark, sir.
yeah. But, even with somebody with his level of impairment, if you get enough repetition of something, it will stick in your memory. Now, it doesn't mean you understand what it is, but you remember it. And let me give you an example. Uh, if I do it often enough and I'm not impaired, I could memorize the formula to calculate parabolic trajectory. And, I practice it enough, I can remember it. And somebody says, tell me the formula, and I could do it. Do I have any idea what it means? Absolutely not. And
Yes, sir.
so I think, Tony, with being asked the same questions over and over and being educated, not uh, specifically, but just through repetition of these evaluations, he was able to encode into memory what the right answer is. Like, you always get asked, what is a judge? What do they do? Well,
Right.
they keep order in the court, yada, yada. If you get asked that question enough time over the years, you're finally probably going to remember it. But
Yes,
that's
sir.
not that's not abstract concept thinking to answer that question. It's not decision making to answer that question. It's just basic knowledge.
Yes, sir.
And rational the rational piece of competency means you can take the basic knowledge, apply it to your own situation, and then make good decisions and
Yes, sir.
understand the outcome of those decisions. And it's like Tony, when he turned down, or when he was telling me he was going to turn down, and I guess he did turn down that uh, plea bargain. He had no. I'm convinced he had no idea the consequences of what he was doing, and
Oh,
it was it was just he saw somebody else do it. They got a good
he
outcome,
did.
so that's what happened to me, and with no appreciation of what kind
The
of
law.
risk he was running
Yes, sir.
in doing.
And I'm glad that you just said that. That's why I kind of got excited while you were saying it, because in one of the evaluations that I don't have it right on hand, but it's in the evaluations. We've spoke on this in other platforms. Dr.
Mhm.
Bender says that Tony is not sophisticated. He says exactly what you said. He's done enough evaluations that he answers them just because he's tired of, like, he's just basically answering it because he's been answered it so many times by so many different evaluators. But he says that
Mhm.
don't make him competent. And he goes on to say deeper that he's not sophisticated enough to trick somebody.
Mhm.
He's not sophisticated enough to
Yeah.
fake these evaluations. What he's doing in these evaluations is really who he is as a person, because that's the traumatic brain injury and everything that's going on with him. That's who he is as a person. That will never change.
Mhm.
So, he's basically saying that every evaluation that he's done on Tony, that he's not faking it. He answers the
Mhm.
questions to the best of his ability, and that he's not sophisticated enough to trick him or to fake these evaluations. So what you get is what he is. Basically, who he is who he is as a
Mhm.
person. But this
Yeah.
is in the evaluation that, and I don't know what actual psychiatrist or what doctor. It says records from Western State in 2015 noted that Mr. Stewart required prompting and assistance with activities of daily living. He also he was also described as vulnerable to exploitation by others due to his cognitive defects and his eagerness
Mhm.
to please others. I thought
Yeah.
that was very unique, because for anybody like me, we're 2 years apart. We grew up, we hung together as kids. I mean, we literally grew up and did everything as
Mhm.
kids, and to the point where he caught the traumatic brain injury. We were together
Yeah.
every day, and even after that, we hung later on. But in the
Uh-huh.
gap of his life when he caught the traumatic brain injury, and don't get me wrong, like even before the traumatic, he already had low IQ. This
Mhm.
predates any of the traumatic brain injury stuff. Him having the learning disabilities, the low
Uh-huh.
IQ. These things were already he was dealing with in life, because he was in you know
Mhm.
special education classes as a kid.
Mhm.
I know this. But what I thought it was unique is, for anybody who knows him today, when he goes on to say he was also described as vulnerable to exploitation by others due to his cognitive defects and his eagerness to please. That
Mhm.
that is him as a person. He he don't see the boogeyman in the world as we see him. And what I tell him is, when we meet people in the world, everybody has an agenda. Some people's agenda
Mhm.
for us is good. Some people's agenda for us is bad. But
Yeah.
everybody in the world is not your friend. They may put the face on or give you the handshake as if they're cool
Mhm.
or they're good people. But people have underlying agendas and ulterior motives that you in your condition can't see, because you're so eager to try to please, or you so eager to
Right.
want to be accepted, because you already look at the world through a different lens.
Mhm.
Versus me and you, when I meet people, I'm going to
Yeah.
take my time on getting to know you as a person, or to, I
Hmm.
want to know about you. I'm gonna do my investigation of you as a person before I come to the conclusion
Yeah.
that, oh, he's a friend, or
Hmm.
he's a good person to be around. Because like I tell him
Yeah.
is, you could be hanging around people and they'll use you because they know you're so giving, or you're
Hmm.
so gullible to, the reality of the world, as we know it is. And that's what I mean
Hmm.
by, he
Yeah.
don't see the boogeyman like we see him, because we
Yeah.
know people come in all forms and fashions. You got to
Yeah.
be careful because people come very deceptive.
Right. Yeah. And, that's an excellent point. And in fact, uh, wrote a letter to Mr. Robinson back in 2016.
Yes, sir.
Uh, and I can send you a copy of it. You probably don't have it, but you said very well what I put in that letter. Uh, and I had only evaluated Tony twice, uh, but this was my clinical impression of him. It's kind of exactly what you said. He was very vulnerable to, as I said in the letter, just wanting people to accept him and like him. And so, if somebody had bad motives, all they had to do is say, hey Tony, you're cool, or hey, let's be pals, and he would respond to people treating him very well, and then they could take advantage of him, just like you said. And
Easily.
I won't get into it, but you said it very well just now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I would love to get a copy of that letter when you get a chance. And like I said, is, I don't want to hold you up all night. As I said, I feel that we made very good points. I thank you for taking your time to come on here. And as I said, it's so alarming to me that I sit, and I'm gonna read one more thing from this before, let me get it for you before, because I have so much paperwork. I would be here for days, but I'm not going to do that. And I thank my friend for allowing me to come here tonight. But so uh, so she goes on to ask a question. I'm gonna read a little bit more from the transcripts real quick. So let me get the right one. So there's a question being answered, and I think I read this already. I said it, but I'm gonna read it for word what he says. So she said yes. He goes on to say, okay, in fact, this is the question asked by Commonwealth Attorney Mary Lester. He said, okay, in
Hmm.
fact, you indicated between your two evaluations his condition had improved. He says correct, and the way I understood it, put some of that towards his more structured lifestyle incarceration. Dr. Bender goes on to say, yes, that's a great example of how that can help. It's also a great example of how he's still very, very impaired cognitively. She goes on to ask the question, sure, okay, does he have any sort of mental disease? He goes on to say, Dr. Bender says, his answer to that is yes, we would call it a neurocognitive disorder, multifactorial ideology. So that
Hmm.
means it's likely due to traumatic brain injury, learning disability, but also the neurocognitive consequences of end stage renal disease.
Hmm.
Mind blowing. Judge hears this. We're sitting in court. We just had a 2-day trial in February. Fast forward
Hmm.
to August 9th of 2020. He subpoenaed the court. He speaks in front of the judge, Commonwealth attorney, members of my family, mother, and then also his attorney. And this is what he says. So then he goes on to say, okay, so she goes on to say, all right, does Anthony have any psychiatry condition like depression or schizophrenia or something like that? He goes on to say, I don't think so. And I'm going to show you where he contradicts himself. He says, I don't think so. I don't remember that being a part of the presentation. She said, okay, mostly just needs help making decisions and being reminded to do. He said, yeah, and staying safe. This is what Dr. Bender says. And yeah, and staying safe. Question, he goes on to say, correct, which sometimes will require people to be around him most of the time. She goes on to say, right, I don't know that he needs someone there if he's sleeping. That's what that's what Dr. Bender says. If he's sleeping, I don't know that he needs someone there for that. She says, okay. He says, but during the day, I would say, yeah, just much all day, I would think. And maybe that can be tuned as if he's showing benefit from of a variety of strategies. Whatever you're using in there, whatever the environmental changes they're trying, whatever they are, he goes on to say. So then when his attorney comes back up, he asks some questions. He says, the Commonwealth attorney asks you between the first and second evaluation, something in reference to that his condition had improved. Is that correct? He says, yes. He says, okay, are you aware of any services that were offered to him between the first and the second evaluation? I'm not. The only thing I'm aware of was that, well, no, I'm not aware of a specific service that was provided to him. I thought that was mind blowing. So, how do you go from incompetent, unrestorable, and for the foreseeable future to competent with no services or restoration in between it, or no type of classes to restore you from incompetence to competence to stand trial?
Yeah.
His lawyer makes this very good point during the podcast with us, and he also makes it throughout the process of the court proceeding. So before the trial, his attorney filed paperwork. He filed a motion saying, "Hey, look, to Judge Chris Russell, he can't aid me. Please have him
Mhm.
reevaluated because there's been a 2 year gap between 2020, um, December 15th of 2020 to February, because it's now we're in 2022. So let's have him reevaluated now. Let's see where he at now." The
Mhm.
judge wouldn't allow it. This is strange to me, but I believe this came back to benefit him. So they don't allow the evaluation. All right, he goes to trial. They found him guilty. Right after the trial, he's been found guilty by the jury. His lawyer files the same motion. Look, we want him evaluated again before sentencing because they say by
Mhm.
law you can have him also evaluated before the sentencing phase. The judge turns him down again. Now
Mhm.
we're at the sentencing hearing. He gets up there. The doctor makes a mockery to me. I can only say it that way because you get up there and go 180 degrees contrary to what you said in the evaluation. Now you're speaking in person at the sentencing hearing, and you're going against your own evaluation. I don't know what you're going on. I don't know how you do that. After that, his lawyer files another motion. Please have him reevaluated based off of what this doctor just said.
Mhm.
Judge denies it again. So 3 times did his lawyer preserve his rights through the courts to please have this man evaluated because what the lawyer was screaming at the judge basically, and I mean he didn't physically scream at him, but what he
Yeah.
was saying to him is, this man cannot aid me in his own defense. And then the law says in Virginia that when a person is found incompetent, before you could try them, they must be restored to competence, but also throughout the legal process of the trial, he's supposed to he as him being a competent person that you're saying, he has to be able to aid his attorney throughout the legal process from trial to to uh, sentencing in his
Mhm.
case. He could not do that. He could not do that. He was oblivious, and his lawyer was just his hands was tied because the judge wasn't giving him no leeway. Like once they found him competent, they wasn't letting off of that because it became like more of a vindictive thing. And that's why we're so outraged as a family now because we saw this throughout the process of the court proceeding. And then
Mhm.
she goes on to ask a question. I thought this was very unique. She says, "So, does Anthony need any type of help putting on clothes?" Dr. Scott Bender says, "I wouldn't think he's not. You're getting it wrong on how you're looking at him as being competent." He said, "But you might have to tell him to put on clean clothes." I thought that was a
Mhm.
very profound statement from a man who just said he was competent, but yet you're saying throughout all of this paperwork that, yeah, but he's still very impaired cognitively. He's dealing with end stage renal disease, neurocognitive defects from the traumatic brain injury. And here we are today having a conversation about a person that Why is he sitting in prison with a 21-year sentence? It's mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, you raise a lot of excellent points. I can't answer them for you.
Yes, sir.
What has happened. It's taken its course, but you know, from what I understand and what I've heard, you've been doing a great job advocating for your brother, and
Yes, sir.
you know, uh, you raise a lot of questions, which I think are legitimate questions, and they need to be answered by
Right. By the
by the
person.
people involved in causing these questions to come to be. Uh, so,
Yes, sir.
uh,
So
uh,
before I let you go, I'm gonna read that. Remember, I told you he said that I just recently. Now I'm gonna go back to it real quick before I go there. It says so. She goes on to say, and this is Dr. Scott Bender's last evaluation. So at the sentencing phase, she asks the question: does Anthony has any psychiatric condition like depression or schizophrenia or something like that? He says, I don't think so. I don't remember that being a large part of the presentation. Let me read you
mm,
what he says in his last evaluation. We can part ways with this conversation. And I thank you once again. I thank God from above that you took your time out to talk with me tonight. It says during the present evaluation, Mr. Stewart reported no other psychiatric evaluation or treatment since our evaluation in 2019. He indicated he has sporadically experienced auditory hallucinations of a voice telling him to engage in dangerous or self-harming behavior. For example, he endorsed that approximately 1 year ago, he heard a voice tell him to grab the gun of a police officer or hurt himself by igniting a lighter in the dialysis treatment center, potentially dangerous to the flammable materials present. He stated he told the dialysis treatment providers who informed the local community service board that was he was never evaluated. So he told them. Then he said he never was evaluated by the Rockbridge Area Community Service Board, which is the mental
mhm,
health clinic in Lexington. He goes on to say he also indicated that more recently, while in Rockbridge Regional Jail, he has requested to meet the Rockbridge Area Community Service mental health providers due to crazy thoughts. Specifically, he endorsed that 3 weeks prior to his evaluation, he experienced auditory hallucinations of an older man's voice telling him to hurt himself. Mr. Stewart indicated the voice persisted for about 5 minutes, and when asked what treatment he believed the CSB in the jail could provide, he expressed the desire to talk to someone or to receive Seroquel. But this doctor said that he had no form of schizophrenia
mm,
or psychiatric condition. But he wrote this in his evaluation. So that's what I was saying. What's so mind blowing to me is that during the proceeding of this trial, this evaluation was used to try him
mm,
because up until that point they weren't able to try him. They took this evaluation once they found him competent to stand trial. This was the evaluation that they used, but it shows and proves to me as far as the Commonwealth attorney who has a duty to not only protect the law, but also to protect the person that she's bringing you know to prosecute.
mhm.
But the judge hears this, and he had copies as well. They had all of this information, and it just was ignored because they were looking for conviction versus help, and that's what our argument with the whole
Oh,
situation or our displeasure with everything is. He
mhm.
went 21 years, 21 years of his life. You never
Yeah,
intervened as the courts and said, let's send him somewhere to get help. And the one time when he did finally get, he was going to go to the Woodrow Wilson Rehabilitative Center in Fishersville to
mhm.
get evaluated. And he got into the program, but he was reincarcerated. And from that day, he never got the opportunity to get into the program because, like we said, if anything ever happened to me, my mother's 80 years old, anybody, he couldn't survive on his own because he's never lived outside the
Yeah,
confinements or outside of my mother's home. He would be
mhm.
lost. So, uh, as I said before, it's a very strange case, but really it's not strange. I see it for what it is. You know, for anybody that took the time like you out the day to just look at it, you see, like you said, and the thing that you're saying, which makes the most sense, what need to be answered is questions to the people who created these questions. Like,
Yeah.
what was your thought pattern on finding this man competent when clearly you contradict yourself and you're clearly saying at the sentencing phase of this that he was never competent?
Yeah.
Like, it's strange to me, but you know,
Yeah. Well,
I think you,
yeah, it certainly, it certainly is a case that needs to be looked at again as you were doing, and marshaling the resources uh, to review all this. And you certainly raise a lot of legitimate questions about what has
yes, sir,
happened here. And
yes, sir,
I do agree that, this needs to be uh, reviewed and looked at, and
yes, sir,
questions need to be answered.
yes, sir,
So
definitely,
I
definitely.
I wish you all the best.
Yes, sir.
If
Well,
you,
I thank you for your time once again, and for the audience, you know, when you get to see this, I thank everybody for tuning in who gets a chance to watch this. Please share the link when when we put up on YouTube. And once again, I thank you so much, Dr. Kim Showalter,
you're
for
welcome.
taking your time out your night to have a conversation with me about Anthony.
Yeah, you're welcome. I
Thank you,
wish you
sir.
all the best.
Same to you.
Good night.
Good night.